All right, let's get started. That just woke everybody up, didn't it? We're so glad to have everyone here with us locally within our offices right here in our little TV studio. And we're also so grateful for all of you online from all around the world that are watching as well. We're very excited to have with us this evening Rabbi Pesach Wolicki. Yay! He and I have known each other for well over 7 years. He's with CJCUC.
Very good.
I did it. All right. It's basically Christians cooperating with Jews for understanding and cooperating. How many believe that Jews and the Christians need to understand each other a little bit better? Yeah. Amen. And I've been to Israel a couple of times, and of course he's been here. How many times have you spoken here now? 4? 5?
No, I think 5 or 6.
5 times,
I'm not
something
sure.
like that?
Something like 5 times, I think. 5 times. I think 5.
Yeah.
We'll say 5.
Okay, and he's written he's written one book many of us already have here, The Cups of Salvation, and then he has a new book that's coming out in a few months that he can tell you a little bit about as well. I think it's Verses for Zion or from Zion?
Verses for Zion.
Verses for Zion. So we want everyone to go check out Amazon or get in touch with him. And how can they get a hold of you or your books?
The best way to get a hold of me is cjcuc.org, the organization. You could also find my columns. I write regularly. I'm a regular weekly columnist for Israel365news.com, if you're familiar with that website. If you're not familiar with that website, you should check it out. It's a fantastic news website about Israel from a biblical perspective, and there's also a lot of Torah teachings on there. So I write a weekly column about the weekly Torah portion, and I also write, once a month I write an op-ed piece there as well, and you can find my podcast there and video content. So there's a lot of material on Israel 365 News website. That's a great way to follow me. And of course, as I just mentioned, I have a podcast, a weekly podcast called Shoulder to Shoulder, which I record weekly together with my co-host, who's a pastor from upstate New York. I'm in Israel most of the time, and he's in New York, and we bring on guests from the Jewish and Christian worlds, and we talk about a lot of things, all sorts of issues that matter to people of faith. So it's a weekly podcast on all podcast platforms called Shoulder to Shoulder. So if you like what you hear tonight and you want more, those are some ways you can find me.
I just think it's great. I mean, for 23 years, I've been trying to find Orthodox Jewish people to relate to and to build bridges with. And he was one of the first ones I found, and I'm just so grateful for Pesach that we've been able to build this bridge. I mean, honestly, I know some of you have been here forever but how many of you have ever literally heard an Orthodox rabbi teach? You know, most people haven't heard an Orthodox rabbi. This is what's so great. To have someone here and from Israel, and you're married, and he has 8 kids.
8 kids.
Yeah, that's right. And
not all at once.
Poor mom.
One at a time.
But when on our Israel trips, one time Pesach, we had him and his wife come spend the night, and he did the Shabbat for us and everything. That's down right. At the Dead Sea, I believe it was.
No, it was in Jerusalem.
It was in Jerusalem.
It was in Jerusalem.
Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, we've had relationships for a long time. We just love each other, and we agree to disagree, and it's okay. That's what we have to realize. It's okay. But anyway, here we are. Passover is coming, and he's going to be teaching today the Orthodox Jewish view, or his view, but evidently he always saves his new teachings for here at El Shaddai. So this is brand new. He's never taught it before, and he'll be teaching us on the blood of Passover.
That's correct.
Take it away, Pesach. Yay!
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Pastor Mark. I appreciate it. And what he just said is very true. Those of you who've heard me speak at El Shaddai Ministries in the past, so I told him this, he was a little bit surprised, but every time I speak here, I debut new material. I always do something I've never done before. I don't know why. I just decided that for El Shaddai Ministries, for this special ministry, I'll always try out something new. Now that comes with some risk, because what I'm gonna be teaching you tonight, I've been working on this for a while, and it makes sense to me. And I'm hoping, as I go through it with you, that it'll make sense to you as well. Now the other thing about it, because it's new, is that I have no idea how long this is going to take. So you might be here a while, or it might go kind of quick, and then we'll have some extra time for discussion. So join me for the ride. It's a little bit of a mystery to me where we're going to end up. But let's delve into the Word of God, and we're going to study. What we're going to focus on is Exodus chapter 12. And you never want to say that one chapter of the Bible is more important than another, but Exodus chapter 12 is both a long chapter and a very, very central chapter in the entire Exodus narrative. And it really should be studied very, very carefully. And what we're going to do is we're not going to read the entire chapter, every verse of it, because it's not all relevant to our topic. But we're going to go through large sections of it, and specifically, those of you who've ever studied with me before, put up your hand, those who are here, if you've studied with me before, if you've heard me speak before. So I see there's a number of people who have. So you know that one of the things that I always stress, and I always make this point, especially when I'm speaking to people who grew up in a Christian context, who study the Bible, who've been raised with the Bible in a Christian context, I always stress to them, you have to read the Bible carefully. And I cannot say that enough. And the reason I say that specifically in a Christian context is that in the Jewish world, the way we're raised to ask all kinds of nitpicky questions about every word and every letter and why is it written exactly that way. And I find that a lot of Christians are not raised to ask those kinds of questions. They kind of just read, and they don't stop and say, wait, why is that phrase there? Why is that repeated? Why is that word there? Why is it in that order? And it's those kinds of questions that can reveal the deepest secrets of the Bible to us. So for example, when the Bible repeats itself or tells us something, it's not always exactly repetition, but sometimes the Bible will simply tell us information that we already knew. It was obvious. If the Bible states the obvious or repeats itself, that looks like extra words, but it's just the opposite. You see, in the Bible, there is no, this is going to sound obvious, but in the Bible, there's no bold or italics or underline, right? The Bible doesn't do that. So how does the Bible stress something? How does it emphasize a point? It does it through repetition. Through repetition or through stating something that I already knew, which is like repetition, right? So we have to pay very close attention, and it's really a lot of those words that we miss because we know them already and they seem kind of normal and we just kind of skim over them like we're reading a novel. But you're not reading a novel. Every word of the Bible, every letter in the Bible is contributing to what we are being taught. Okay? So we're going to read very carefully. We're going to read the verses of a very famous section of Exodus 12. I think everyone here knows about what happened in Egypt the night of the Exodus, where they put blood on the doorposts and on the lintel of their homes, of the Paschal lamb that they slaughtered. We're going to take a close look at how this is presented in Exodus 12. We're going to ask some of those careful reading type of questions, and we're going to look also into some of the Jewish traditions that have been inherited by us for thousands of years about what took place that night. And we're going to discover some very important lessons about the Exodus, about Passover, but more importantly, about our own life of faith, our own relationship to God, and what it means to be redeemed, to be saved, to be taken out of bondage, which is what the Exodus is really all about. And we all are constantly, every day when we wake up in the morning, we have to once again free ourselves from bondage. We have to do it on a daily basis. It's a constant battle. So the lessons in here are not just about what happened that night over 3,300 years ago. The lessons we're going to discover are about what happens within each and every one of us every day. Here we go. Let's begin. So we'll pick it up at verse 3. The opening two verses of Exodus chapter 12 are about the new moon. Like I said, we're not reading every verse in the chapter. We're focusing on certain verses that relate to the Paschal lamb and specifically the blood. So this is God speaking to Moses and Aaron. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb for each father's house. Hold on a second. A lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Let's sum this up. Everyone, on the 10th of the month of Nisan, that's the month that we're in now, on the 10th of the month of Nisan, every man shall take a lamb for the household. Okay, on the 10th of the month. And it's supposed to be according to the number of people in the household, or households could get together so that it matches the right number of people for the lamb, for eating the lamb. Because the lamb was not the whole meal. The lamb, each person just had a little piece of it. So if you have a small family of let's say 4 people, and you have a whole lamb, obviously, if you each eat one little piece, you're going to have a lot left over, and you're not, as we'll see, you're not allowed to have any left over. So families would get together. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it, and I underlined that for a reason, we'll get to that in a moment, until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. Okay, before we get to the blood on the doorposts, let's ask a very simple question. If this was to be slaughtered on the 14th of the month, why are they being commanded to take it on the 10th of the month and hold on to it for 4 days? Why are they being commanded to do that? And let me point something very important out here. The Passover offering, the Paschal Lamb offering, was offered every single year when there was a tabernacle, when there was a temple. That was the commandment. It didn't actually happen every year. There were years where the people of Israel didn't do it. We know that from various passages in the Bible that talk about times that they didn't do it. But that's a historical issue. From the standpoint of the command in the Bible, this is to be done every single year. But that doesn't mean that every single year the people of Israel were commanded to do what they did in Egypt. The Passover offering, I want to lay this out really clear. So if you were spacing out, listen carefully to this, because it's critical to the whole talk. It's critical to the whole talk. The Passover offering that was done every single year, and God willing, when we rebuild the temple, we will do it again every year. That Passover offering does not have all the same laws as the Passover lamb that they slaughtered, ate, etc. that night in Egypt. That one that was done that night in Egypt had rules that were unique to that one-time event that time. One of those rules is this. One of those rules is that the lamb had to be taken 4 days before. In later years, a regular year of the Passover throughout the history of the people of Israel during the temple times, you could just show up that day, pick out a lamb that morning, and slaughter it that day on the 14th. In fact, probably that's what most people did, because you have to have a lamb that doesn't have a blemish. So why pick it out early when it could develop a blemish between now and then? You should wait till the last minute, pick a lamb, and make sure you pick one that doesn't have a blemish, and then slaughter it an hour later. But for some reason in Egypt, God commanded the people of Israel that one time to separate out this lamb 4 days before. So we have to ask the question, why? Now, when they're told to separate it out 4 days before, which is right here in verse 3, but then when we go ahead to verse 6, it says, now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Now, let me tell you what's wrong with this translation. And this is a very important point. The Hebrew for the words that are underlined here, that are translated here as now you shall keep it, do not actually say that in Hebrew. What the Hebrew says is Vahaya lachem lemishmeret. What that means, I'm going to straight translation, it shall be for you as a safeguard. Now that seems a little backwards because the sheep isn't guarding you. What do you mean, it shall be a safeguard for you? It sounds like the sheep's guarding you. Or what's a mishmeret? A thing that's guarded or something that's guarding? It's unclear what the word means. It could be something guarding me or something that I'm guarding. It's a guarding, a safeguard. It shall be for you. Now, if God was commanding, if the command here is simply, you should guard it for 4 days, then it should be written in the form of a command, you shall guard it. And we have that phrase in other contexts in the Torah about other things that should be kept or guarded. Like the word for guarding and keeping is the same word in Hebrew. And for example, when it says, you shall keep the Sabbath day, it just says it as a command. Second person command form, you shall guard. It doesn't say that here. Even though it's translated here as you shall keep it or you shall guard it, that is incorrect. Okay? So we have this funny phrase. So bringing us back to what I said before, when you read the Bible carefully, unfortunately in translation you don't pick up everything. Some things you do, some things you don't. Some of the things I show you, you could pick up without knowing the Hebrew. But this one I'm telling you in the Hebrew is a strange phrase. Anytime the Bible writes something a little weird, that's when you have to slam on the brakes and say, whoa, what's God trying to tell me here? Okay, so so far we have a couple questions already. We have, why did they have to take it on the 10th of the month for the Passover of Egypt? We'll call it the Passover of Egypt when we're talking about things that were only done with that one, okay? So for the Passover of Egypt, why was it taken on the 10th month, 4 days before they slaughter it? Number two, what does this phrase mean, and it shall be for you as a safeguard? Okay? Which, again, most translators think it just means you're supposed to protect it. You're supposed to guard it. Okay. Let's keep reading. We're going to ask a few more questions before we answer things. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. This was also only done of the Passover in Egypt. And the Passover offering was done in later years. There was no commandment to take blood and put it on your doorposts. In fact, the Bible tells us that it's a pilgrimage festival. So people were not even they weren't even slaughtering the Passover lamb at home or anywhere near their home. They were traveling to Jerusalem to do the pilgrimage in Jerusalem, and they were bringing the offering in the temple. There was no doorposts or lintel. This was only done in Egypt that one time, where they put blood on the doorposts and the lintel. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire. With unleavened bread, with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. These details are not the subject of our talk tonight. They're very interesting, and maybe there could be a different talk altogether about how it had to be cooked. And thus you shall eat it. Now this is interesting. This is also unique to the Passover of Egypt. Passover of later generations, later years, these rules did not apply. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. We were always told by our mamas, you're not supposed to eat quickly, right? We're being told you're supposed to eat it fast. You're supposed to rush. It is now the Hebrew word is Passover. The English word is Passover. The Hebrew word is Pesach. That's my name. So I didn't translate it here because I'm not sure that Passover, which is, everyone translates Pesach as Passover. That's what we call it. I'm actually not sure it's a great translation. I'll explain why soon. It's a Pesach for the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood, now it finally tells us what the blood is for. Now the blood shall be a sign, and I underline the words for you. I underline them because I'm reading the Bible carefully. And here I have a word, it's one word in Hebrew, for you, lachem. In English it's two words. Here I have one of those words that if it wasn't there, I never would have noticed it. This verse could have said, now the blood shall be a sign on the houses where you are. What does the word for you add? The blood shall be a sign on the houses where you are. That would have been great. So why does it say for you? We'll get to that. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now, why did I say that I don't like the name Passover? Let me explain. The word is Pesach. And it's based on what happens in verse 13, right here. When I see the blood, upasachti. Okay, listen to the words. Pesach is Passover. The verb I will pass over is upasachti. Here's the problem. When that verb appears elsewhere in the Bible, it doesn't mean to skip over something. We see this verb in the story of Elijah at Mount Carmel. When he is, the scene in the book of Kings is there were these priests of Baal, these pagan priests in the nation of Israel, and Elijah at Mount Carmel defeats them. He shows that God is the real God. He brings an offering, they bring an offering, God burns up his offering, it doesn't burn up theirs. An important scene. In that scene, because these false prophets were also Jews, it was part of the nation of Israel who were worshiping idols at the time. He says to them, Elijah says to them, let me pull up the verse here. Hold on a second. Before you give me back my screen, I'm going to go find a verse. Excuse me. Oh, I'm not online. Oops. Can I get on your Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Which one is it? ESM Mesh? You want to put the password in?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm doing this while you're live. It just occurred to me that I didn't make a slide with this verse on it, and I want to go dig it up. Okay. Nope. Try that again. Oh, I'll tell you what. No, I'll tell you what. My keyboard was in Hebrew.
Oh.
I just switched it back to English. I was typing in Hebrew before.
All right.
Sorry. There we go. Okay. I'm sorry about this delay. So 1 Kings chapter 18. Here we go. So when Elijah speaks to them, verse 21, Elijah went before the people, and he says to the people of Israel, how long will you waver between two opinions? How long will you waver between two opinions? But what the literal Hebrew is how long will you, and then the verb is the same verb of passing over. Upon, on, two opinions. And what it's referring to is, and then the verse continues, If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. So think about that verse for a second. How long will you be Pasach, that same word used for Passover, on two things? Pasach al, pass on. In that verse, he's talking about that you're believing in you're worshiping Baal and you're worshiping God. So the Pasach al, that verb really means to be in both places. So when God uses the exact same verb and says, I will Pasach over your houses, listen carefully. We have to think of it backwards the way we usually do. He wasn't passing over the Israelite houses. He was passing over the Egyptian houses. He was touching each of the Jewish houses. That's what that verb actually means. Elsewhere in the Bible, that verse means to hop. It's like hopping from one house to the other. So if God says, I will hop on your homes, Pasach al, hop upon, it doesn't mean to pass over them. So we picture it that he's not touching the Jewish homes. He's only touching the Egyptian homes. But it's just the reverse. He's touching the Jewish homes and passing over the Egyptian homes, but the verb doesn't mean to pass over. So that's just, God is doing, and my point here is this. This sounds like a nitpicky point, but let me explain the point I'm making, because you might be wondering what this has to do with where I'm going. We tend to think of that night in Egypt, that what God was doing, he was doing to the Egyptians. And by putting blood on the doorposts, God's not going to touch this home. Right? That's how we think of it. And I want to argue, no. God was killing the firstborn Egyptians, and he was touching each of the Jews. Now, what does that touching mean? Let's continue with these verses, and we'll discover it soon. Okay. So where are we? We're up to, let me get back to my presentation. Why is that? Why do I not have that screen here? Oh, here we go. Oh, I got it. Okay, here we are. Good. Okay, so the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Well, what we know that it actually means, I'll touch each of you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now we're jumping ahead a few verses, okay? We're skipping some verses that aren't relevant to our topic tonight. We're now up to verse 21. We just skipped 8 verses. So God commands Moses. So far what we read was God speaking to Moses and Aaron and telling them what to tell the people of Israel. Remember, this whole passage started, go speak to the children of Israel, tell them to take a lamb on the 10th, hold on to it till the 14th, it shall be a safeguard for you until then, and then you're going to kill it, you're going to take blood, you're going to put it on your doorposts, you're going to eat it, and I am going to jump from house to house and save you from what's going on in Egypt. But this is all to be relayed to the people of Israel. Then later in the chapter, here in verse 21, we finally have Moses relaying it to the people. And look at what he says. Then Moses calls all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Pesach lamb. That's what he tells. So he relays that. And then he adds something in that we didn't see that God told him. So we know what God said to Moses, but now when Moses is relaying it, he adds in a new detail. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. 2 issues in the verse. Issue number 1, did Moses just add in a detail that God didn't tell him? Clearly he did. So either God told him and it's not recorded, or Moses made it up. Either way, we have a new detail. Why the bunch of hyssop? If the object is to get the blood on the doorposts, why is Moses telling them what kind of brush to use? What's the significance of the bunch of hyssop? Number 2, reading the Bible carefully. Look at verse 22. I don't need the second mention of the blood. I'm going to reread the verse, leaving out some words, and it would have been totally understood just fine. That's the name of the game. If you can read a verse and leave out some words that are there, and you wouldn't have known the difference, and nothing's missing, then you have, quote unquote, extra words, which are never extra. And those are the words you have to study hardest. Okay, so let's take a look at the verse again. You shall take a bunch of hyssop, so far so good, dip it in the blood that's in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts. Period. Why does it have to say with the blood that's in the basin? Isn't that, it's kind of understood, right? You're supposed to take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts. The second mention of the blood with the blood that's in the basin is completely extra. What is it teaching me? Let's keep going. And none of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. Keep reading. The Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. Now I'm jumping ahead a few verses. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Pesach sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. And now I'm jumping ahead. Later in the chapter, we get more details about the Passover rules, about the rules of the Passover offering. And once again, we're told something we didn't know before. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, the Pesach to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. Thus all the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. So we're told, so the laws are kind of scattered through the chapter. We jumped through the chapter, we skipped a lot of passages, but the laws of the Passover involved the blood on the doorposts. That was only done that night in Egypt. We have the taking of it 4 days before. That was only done that night in Egypt. And then we have this rule that no one who's uncircumcised can partake of the Passover offering. So we have a bunch of questions. As I raised before, we're going to now address this question first. This is the question of what does it mean that it shall be for you as a safeguard? As I said, that phrase, now you shall keep it for 4 days, is really v'haya lachem lemishmeret. It shall be for you as a safeguard. What does this mean? So we're about to read, as I change the slide over, we're about to read a comment by the person who is without question the most famous and influential commentator on the Torah in the Jewish tradition. And that's someone who's known by the acronym of his name. He's known as Rashi. Some of you who've studied with rabbis before may have heard his name, if you've heard the name Rashi. He lived in the 11th century in France. The most authoritative commentator. Usually his comments are very short. He'll quote from the rabbinic tradition as a way of answering questions about strange things that are in the verses. So when you have a weird word or a weird phrase, like the one we're dealing with here, what does it mean? It shall be for you as a safeguard. He's a good place to look, because if you have strange wording like that, you know he's going to comment. Here, his comment is unusually long and involved, and seems to go very far away from the plain meaning of the verse, which is not like him. His comments usually are explaining the plain meaning of the verse. This comment is highly unusual, and it's from the rabbinic tradition. He pulls together a few sources, and we're going to read it, and then for the rest of this talk, we're going to unpack, based on what Rashi was saying in this very confusing comment, we're going to understand the answer to all of our questions. Okay? That's what we're doing. So if it's been boring until now, this is a good time to start paying attention. Here we go. Here's Rashi. It shall be for you a safeguard. V'haya lachem lemishmeret. This implies examining. Okay, meaning the simple meaning, as the translators say, you're supposed to guard it or look after it. It means you're supposed to examine it. This text implies that it requires examination for blemishes during the 4 days before slaughter. And now Rashi asks the question that we asked. And why did he order that it should be taken from the flock 4 days before its slaughter, something which he did not command in respect to the paschal lamb that was offered by succeeding generations? Exactly the question I raised. I didn't make up the question. Rashi raises the question, why is this a special rule that one time in Egypt 3,300 years ago that they had to take it 4 days early? Rashi answers by quoting a rabbi from the times of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is, he lived just after the destruction of the Second Temple in the 2nd century, the rabbi Rashi's quoting. Rabbi Mattia ben Charash would say, "Behold, Scripture says, Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, and I passed over thee and looked upon thee, and behold, thy time was the time of love." Meaning God is metaphorically looking down at the people of Israel, and there's a time where God has decided that it's a time of love, a time where he's going to save them. There had arrived the time to fulfill the oath which I had sworn to Abraham to redeem his children. They, however, possessed no divine commands, no merits in which to engage in order that they should merit to be redeemed. As it is said, thou wast naked and bare. He therefore gave them 2 commands, the blood of the paschal lamb and the blood of the circumcision. For that night they circumcised themselves, as it says in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 6, same chapter there. When I passed over thee, I saw thee wallowing in thy bloods. The literal Hebrew says damayich, your bloods, plural, i.e., in 2 kinds of blood. Further it states, as for thee, also because of the blood of the covenant, I released thy prisoners out of the pit where there is no water. And yet another reply to this question is that because they were sunk in idolatry, they had no merit gained by the practice of a divine command. He said unto them, Mishchu, draw, pull away, withdraw your hands from idols, and take unto yourselves a lamb to fulfill a divine command. This is a very long and confusing answer to our question. Let me sum up what we just read, because you probably got confused while I was reading it and were like, whoa, where are we? Where are we going? And that's exactly the point that I made. Rashi usually has very short comments where he just addresses an issue in the text, and here he goes on this whole long spiel with this whole long teaching, quoting verses in Ezekiel. What on earth is he talking about? Let's sum up what Rashi just said. The question we had was, why does the verse say, it shall be for you a safeguard? What exactly does that mean? So Rashi starts very simply and says, well, it means that you're supposed to protect, you're supposed to look after it and check it to make sure that it's okay. But that doesn't really answer the question of why the verse uses this weird word. If that was what it was, it should say, you shall guard it for 4 days. And as I said to you, the verse doesn't say, you shall guard it as a command. It says, it shall be for you a safeguard. So Rashi hasn't really answered the question yet. So then he goes on this whole long speech. And he says, well, the reason that God commanded this special command that he didn't command for later generations, that it has to be 4 days before, is because of this teaching from this Rabbi Mattia ben Charash, who taught us that at the time of the Exodus, based on his exegesis of these 2 verses in Ezekiel, that at the time of the Exodus, God wanted to redeem the nation of Israel from Egypt. But, God doesn't do anything for nothing. He doesn't do things for free. He needs the people to do something to merit the redemption as well, something. And they had no merits at all. So he gave them 2 commandments, and they both involved blood. The commandment to slaughter the Passover offering and the commandment to circumcise. And they did them on the same day. And how does he derive that they did them on the same day? Well, based on the verse in Ezekiel that says that the people of Israel were wallowing in their bloods at the time that they were redeemed by God. Bloods plural. So why bloods plural? Why not blood singular? Because it's two bloods, the blood of the Passover, the blood of the circumcision. And through the merit of these two bloods, they were able to be redeemed. And then he goes on to say that as another response to this question, later on in the chapter, in verse 21, Moses speaks to the elders of Israel and he says to them, Mishchu uchulachem, draw and take a sheep for the Passover offering. So because he uses that extra word, draw and take, it means withdraw your hands from the idols. That's his answer to the question. Rashi gave us way more information than we thought we needed. And he makes this whole case. Now, how does all of that answer why you're supposed to keep it for 4 days? What does keeping it for 4 days have to do with the circumcision? What does any of this have to do with it? Let me ask another question. I'll just throw it in there, throw it into the mix, which is the blood on the doorposts. What's it for? Oh, because God is going to know which house is to pass over. Okay, God knows who's in what house. So let's make it very clear. God doesn't need blood on doorposts to know who's a member of the people of Israel and who's not. That's clear. And that's why I underlined the word. Let's go back to this slide. I'm jumping around on slides, so stay with me on the slides, please. Verse 13. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. The blood is not a sign for God. God doesn't need signs. God knows exactly who's who. The blood on the doorpost was a sign for us. It's a sign for you. Okay. Why wasn't the blood on the firstborns themselves? Imagine if this had been the ritual. You know, what's normal to us is how the Bible's written because we were raised with it. But imagine had the story in the Bible been that you're supposed to slaughter the Passover offering and you're supposed to take some of the blood and smear it on the forehead of the firstborn. Because all the firstborns in Egypt are going to die, and the firstborns who have blood smeared on their head will live. That would have made perfect sense to us had that been the story, right? Why does the blood have to be on the house? Let's go back a little further to the beginning of the chapter, right to the beginning of where we started, verse 3, and notice the use of the word house. Let's read this again. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of the month, every man shall take himself a lamb for each father's house. And then, what did I say about biblical repetition? When something is repeated in the Bible, it means it's being stressed. It means it's the main point. This verse should have ended after, on the 10th of the month, every man shall take himself a lamb for each father's house. I then know that each household is supposed to have a lamb. Then the verse repeats, a lamb for a household. Repetition means this is the main point. So we have two mentions of house. And then, and if the household is too small for a lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. There's such a stress on the house. The blood is on the doorposts of the house. You're not supposed to leave the house. It's according to each family. This isn't just about the firstborns not dying. This is about each family asserting its identity as a family. You see, slaves don't really have a normal family life. Free people have a normal family life because when we're free, the smallest unit of sovereignty in a healthy society is the family. The family is a unit of sovereignty. And then a town is made up of families, or a tribe. And then a nation is made up of tribes. That's the biblical view of a nation. But the smallest unit is the family. The Jewish people that night were asserting their identity as families. And that's why there's a stress on the house and the home. That's why the blood is on those doorposts and not on the heads of the firstborns themselves, because it's not about them. It's about the whole family. But let me jump ahead. Here we go. After Rashi, now we're going to start finally getting some answers. I want to point out to you a very cryptic quote from the Midrash. Now, in most settings where I'm talking to Christians, I can't quote Midrash. But in El Shaddai Ministries, you guys know a little bit about what Midrash is. It's these rabbinic teachings. They're often these like cryptic statements that don't seem to make much sense, kind of like the Rashi we just read. And the rabbis are really conveying deep wisdom in these cryptic statements. That's the way wisdom was conveyed a long time ago. But let's take a look at this Midrash. God said in one of the verses we just read that you should put the blood on the doorposts, and I will pass over all the houses, and I will see the blood, right? And I will pass over your houses, or I'll touch your houses, as I maintain it means, and I'll as I kill the Egyptians. And I shall see the blood. And says the Midrash, a statement that doesn't make much sense to us for a few reasons. I shall see the blood of the binding of Isaac. As it is written, and Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will see. Okay, let me first tell you what the Midrash just said, and then I'll tell you 2 reasons why it makes 0 sense. First of all, here's what the Midrash just said, that when God was speaking to Moses and telling him, this is what you're going to tell the people, you're going to put blood on the doorposts, and I'm going to pass through Egypt, and when I see the blood, I will pass over those homes, and you're not going to die, the Egyptians will die. When God said, I will see the blood, he was implying also that he would be reminded of the blood from the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. Problem number 1, Isaac wasn't sacrificed. Right? The story doesn't end with the blood of Isaac. He's alive at the end of that story, if I remember correctly. That's one reason it makes no sense. The second reason it makes no sense is, what on earth does this mean that God is going to see the blood of the binding of Isaac? The blood that he's going to see is of the Passover offering. What is this reference to Isaac? What does it mean God's going to see the blood of Isaac? Forget the fact that Isaac was never killed. So let's understand what's happening here. Oh, right. And the Midrash ties this to the verse at the end of the at the end of the scene of the binding of Isaac, when the angel comes down and stops Abraham and then blesses him, right? Abraham offers up a sheep instead of Isaac, remember? And then he blesses him. Abraham names the place. The place where this happens, he names it Adonai Yireh, which means the Lord will see, which is a very interesting name. He doesn't name it the Lord has seen, like as though God just saw him. He names it a future tense, the Lord will see, referring to some seeing in the future. So the Midrash picks up on that and says, aha, when Abraham said at the binding of Isaac that the Lord will see, it was referring to the Exodus from Egypt. So somehow the Midrash is trying to connect the Exodus from Egypt to the binding of Isaac. This is a strange thing. Let's take a look at a couple verses from the binding of Isaac. So when Abraham and Isaac are walking up the mountain, and Isaac says to his father Abraham, he says, I see we have fire and I see we have wood, but where's the animal? Where's the sheep we're going to be slaughtering? And Abraham responds and he says, my son, God will provide, and literally it doesn't say provide. All the translators translate it as provide, but the Hebrew is God will see for himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. And then Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will see. The Lord will see. The Lord will see a lamb the Lord will see the blood in the future. Isaac, interestingly enough, is the first person to be circumcised on the 8th day. And when Isaac is circumcised, the Bible says explicitly, and Abraham circumcised Isaac, his son, on the 8th day, as God commanded him. The first person to ever have a circumcision according to the official command of God, meaning 8th day. Abraham wasn't circumcised on the 8th day. Neither was Ishmael. Isaac is the first one to be circumcised on the 8th day. Right, that's Isaac. And then Isaac is the original offering, replaced by a sheep. Now, was Isaac offered on the altar? As I said, of course not. He was saved at the end of the story. But he actually was. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say you're a storekeeper. I walk into your store and I ask you, how much is that item? And you say it's $100. I say, okay, fine. And I take it and I walk up to the counter and I pull out $100 and I hand you the $100. And you say, you know what? I'm going to give you a discount. I'm only going to charge you $80. And you give me back $20. And I say, oh, thank you. And I start walking out the door. And then you stop me as I'm leaving and you say, hey, you owe me $20. You didn't pay for that item. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? I offered you $100. The fact that you only wanted $80 is your business. I paid in full. What's the analogy? God told Abraham to offer his son as an offering. Abraham said, fine. God then said, no, I'll give you a discount. You don't have to offer your son. You could just give me an animal. Abraham said, okay. Can God now treat Abraham as though he didn't offer his son Isaac? No, he did. So spiritually speaking, Isaac was sacrificed. God chose not to accept full payment. But that was his business. The payment was made. So spiritually speaking, we can speak of the blood of Isaac. Because the blood of that sheep that was brought in his place was really his blood. It's the $80 instead of the 100. God didn't want the 100. He didn't want Isaac's blood. But it was offered. He gave him a discount. He took the sheep's blood instead. Now this connection, I mentioned that Isaac is the first one to be circumcised, and then he's the sheep that's offered. Let's point out something else about Isaac. I believe that 2 years ago, or 2 times ago, during COVID I didn't come, a few years ago I spoke here about Isaac. Was anyone here that night? I spoke about Isaac. And when I spoke about Isaac, I pointed something very important out about the binding of Isaac. At the end of the binding of Isaac, the angel comes down and blesses Abraham. And when the angel blesses Abraham, the angel blesses him that his children will be numerous, and that they'll inherit the land, and that they'll bring blessing to all the families of the earth, which are all things that God has said to Abraham before. Not that they're boring, but they're repeated. But at the end of that binding of Isaac, there's only one thing that God says in that blessing, that the angel says in the name of God, in that blessing, that is a brand new blessing that Abraham hasn't heard before. And we can conclude based on that that's the real point of the binding of Isaac. It's the only new blessing Abraham gets as a result of passing that test. And what God says to Abraham then is, your children will inherit the gate of their enemies. That as a result of being willing to sacrifice your children, this is a sad truth that's been true for all time, that we can only win wars, sadly, if we're willing to make that sacrifice, to put our children in uniform, send them out there, and be willing to sacrifice them. It's a sad fact. Let's face it. You can only win wars if you're willing to sacrifice your children in the process. Not that we want child sacrifice, but if you're willing to do that, you can win wars. I believe that's the point of the binding of Isaac. And Isaac, in that talk about Isaac that night, I emphasized and I showed that Isaac's life was really devoted to the nationalistic side of the covenant. remember that? About how Isaac was really the defender of the land. Abraham was much more of a universalist. He loves everyone. He doesn't want to kick out Ishmael. He doesn't want to, he prays for Sodom and Gomorrah. He loves everybody. Isaac was more about the independence and the strength of the people of Israel. So I'm probably confusing you. Why am I saying all of this? We're moving towards an answer. The connection between the Passover offering and circumcision is not only in Exodus 12, where God tells us, we're told that everyone who eats of the Passover offering must be circumcised. But we also see it, and it's not only with this interesting connection of Isaac through the Midrash that he's the sheep, but he's also the first one to be circumcised. But we see it also very explicitly in the book of Joshua. Let's take a look at this verse. This is this is Joshua chapter 5. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourself." The people of Israel are about to enter the land, near the beginning of the book of Joshua. They're on the other side of the Jordan River, and they're about to cross over and enter the land and take possession of the land. And God says to Joshua, Make knives for yourself and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. What's the second time? Because the first time was when they left Egypt. So it was when they had finished circumcising. I skipped the verses from 2 to 8 because it explains why they hadn't circumcised themselves during the 40 years in the desert, because they were traveling and it was dangerous. So although they were all circumcised at the Exodus, then for the 40 years in the desert, the people of Israel did not do circumcision. It says that right there in the Bible, because of the travel. And then they're about to enter the land of Israel. God says, "Oh, okay, fine. For 40 years I didn't make you circumcised because, being in the desert, it could be dangerous. But now we're about to enter the land. Everyone has to be circumcised. Make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." So it was when they had finished circumcising all the people, and they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day," which means it has to do with the circumcision. Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight. Notice that's the very next verse. Right after they finish circumcising, what do? They do the Passover offering. Okay, I think it's time for me to give you some real answers. What's the real connection between the Passover and circumcision? We know that when Moses was talking to Pharaoh about asking for him to release the people of Israel so they could go worship God, that at one point Pharaoh said, "Why don't you just worship God here in the land of Egypt?" And Moses said, "We can't do that, because the animals that we're going to slaughter are worshipped by the Egyptians. They're gods. And how could we slaughter the Egyptian gods without them stoning us?" Now you could picture that a member of the people of Israel who's a slave in Egypt would be more than happy to slaughter the Egyptian god as a sign of his freedom and emancipation from slavery. Stick it to the man. Here's the Egyptians, they're ruling over us, we're going to slaughter their god. It's a sign of that we're no longer subservient to the Egyptians. You could also picture slaves among the people of Israel who were kind of afraid to do it because they're still living in fear of their Egyptian masters. Even though they know that God's about to redeem them, it's a little scary. They've been serving these Egyptian masters. You have a slave mentality, and now God's telling them to take a sheep and slaughter it. They're in Egypt in front of their Egyptian masters. So there were probably Jews who were hesitant to do that. So here in Egypt, God tells them to take the animal 4 days before. And what's going to happen during those 4 days? If they have to take the animal 4 days before, that means that they're taking an animal out of the flock, they're separating it out. Their Egyptian masters are going to notice. Say, what are you doing with that sheep? Well, I'm going to slaughter it. I'm going to slaughter that sheep. That took a lot of guts. For some, for those who were afraid. So for those who were afraid, taking it 4 days in advance was a way that they had to show that they really trusted God and that they were no longer afraid of their Egyptian masters. But at the same time, there were those among the Jews who were probably more than happy to do it, as I said, who were happy to stick it to the Egyptian masters. This is a big rebellion. This is throwing off the chains of slavery. And we are going to put it in their face. We're going to take their God, we're going to slaughter it, we're going to eat it. And not only that, we're going to advertise that we did it by smearing our door frames with blood so that everyone can know that we slaughtered an Egyptian god. Now, this type of emancipation, this type of expressing your national identity and showing that you're no longer subservient to the Egyptians, could also fill people with nationalistic pride, can't it? You could picture some of those younger Jewish slaves who are now like, oh yeah, we're throwing off the chains, we're throwing off the yoke of slavery, we are slaughtering their God. And it was all about sticking it to the Egyptians. So what does God do? He says, listen, this is not all about sticking it to the Egyptians. This is about service of me. You see, if we want freedom, but we don't want to be subservient to God, then freedom is just chaos. Right? Think about our own society. There's plenty of people who want freedom, liberty, but that doesn't mean that they want to serve the Lord. So what's the freedom all about? It's about not having rules, being free. If we're just free for the sake of being free, then we're not serving the Lord. God wants us to be free from human masters so that we accept Him as our master. So what did God do? He commanded the people of Israel to circumcise themselves before eating the Passover offering. Because circumcision is all about submitting to God. That's all about sacrificing for God, from myself, from my own flesh. But that's about submission to the will of God. So God says, you can't partake of the Passover offering. You can't just slaughter the Egyptian god and wave the flag of freedom if you're not also submitting yourself to me. Because if you're waving that flag of freedom but you're not submitting yourself to me, then it's just freedom with no purpose. Then it's just chaos. Then you're just a hippie. Right? Freedom with no structure. So you have to circumcise yourself. You have to submit yourself to God if you're going to also slaughter that Passover offering. Now, you remember that I showed you that the commandment that everyone must be circumcised came all the way at the end of the chapter. Remember that? It didn't come at the beginning. And it was like later on in the chapter it told us. Those rules that were stated later on in the chapter were only told to the people of Israel right before they slaughtered the Passover offering. Our tradition tells us that Moses held back telling them that they had to circumcise themselves until the day before. Why did he do that? Until the day before. He didn't tell them, meaning when he told them on the 10th of the month, or he actually told them at the beginning of the month, on the 10th of the month, take it. He didn't say they're going to have to circumcise themselves. And then along comes the 14th of the month, and he says, oh, by the way, you've been holding on to this sheep for a few days. You've been sticking it to your slave masters. You've been getting bold about the fact that you're now becoming free and slaughtering the Egyptian god. Before you go ahead and slaughter it and eat it, you got to circumcise yourself. And why did he wait till the last minute to do that? Why did he wait till the last day? So that on the day that they slaughtered the Passover offering, it's the same day that they circumcised. And that's what that verse in Ezekiel was talking about. Remember that verse that Rashi quoted in Ezekiel, saying that they were wallowing in our bloods, the two bloods, the blood of the circumcision and the blood of the Passover? Because God wanted the blood of the circumcision and the blood of the Passover to be mixed. So that night, all the people of Israel, we have to change our view of what happened then. All the people of Israel in their homes, all those firstborns and all those heads of household were all circumcised that day. There was two bloods that they were dealing with that day. They were dealing with the blood of the circumcision. They were dealing with the blood of the Passover offering, because submission to God and freedom from human masters have to go together. You cannot have freedom from human masters if it doesn't go together with submission to God. The circumcision is that humble submission to God, because freeing ourselves from our human masters can turn into arrogance. Circumcision reminds us that we're humble servants of God. And that's why Moses commanded them to use the hyssop. What's hyssop? So hyssop is it grows near to the ground. Throughout the Bible, it's a symbol of humility. When the Bible tells us that that Solomon had the wisdom to understand all things in nature, he talks about things that are very great and very high, mountains and tall trees, all the way down to the hyssop. The hyssop is the lowliest it's a shrub that grows along the ground. Because it's a symbol of humility, Moses was saying, when you're smearing that blood, that sign of, that show of defiance and of freedom and of rebellion against your Egyptian masters, you have to do it with humility. You have to be humble about it. Now, I raised the issue of the repetition of the words, the blood that is in the basin. Let's look at that verse again. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two doorposts. Right? The verse could have ended there. With the blood that is in the basin. Why that extra with the blood that is in the basin? So, the words with the blood, that extra with the blood, those are the words that are extra in the verse, the words that are repeated. And as I told you, every time the Bible repeats words, those are the words that are the deepest. That's where we have to dig. With the blood, min hadam in Hebrew, is 5 letters. The first letter is going from right to left. Mem is 40, Nun is 50, Hey is 5, Dalet is 4, and then Mem again is 40, that's 139. Dmei Milah, the blood of circumcision, is also 139. This, I didn't make this up. This is handed down, this is written centuries and centuries ago. This is an ancient teaching. And it's this teaching which is also built on that verse in Ezekiel about the two bloods that God saw at that night in Egypt. And this deep connection between circumcision and the blood of the Passover. That what God saw that night, when God looked down upon us that night, He didn't just see the blood of the Passover offering. According to our tradition, the blood of the circumcision and the blood of the Passover were mixed. And that's what was smeared on the doorposts. A mixture of circumcision blood and Passover blood. Now, whether that's historically accurate or it's a metaphor in our understanding of what took place spiritually, doesn't matter. Let's understand what the message here is. Once again, the message is that if we are to achieve liberty, to be free from human masters, to be free from human bondage, that is not a goal unto itself. Because when freedom and liberty are a goal unto themselves, they can turn into, I do whatever I want. I'm a free person. And I'm the master of my own life. I have no human masters. I'm free. It can turn into the most arrogant expression in the human spirit. But freedom together with circumcision, meaning freedom from human masters, together with submission to God, as symbolized by the circumcision, that's what Passover is really all about. That's what Passover is really all about. So it's the blood of circumcision together with the blood of the Passover. So I share all of this. My key point in all of this is as a preparation for the Passover festival, which is about to come upon us. And there's a lot of things we focus on. There are themes of the different festivals. And people tend to focus with Passover on the theme of freedom. Passover is the festival of freedom, emancipated from Egypt, but emancipated with a purpose. We're emancipated from human bondage so that we are free to accept the kingdom of God, so that we are free to become His servants. Not that we're not going to be anybody's servants anymore. We're no longer going to be servants of man, and we'll become servants of God. So the question that sort of led us down this rabbit hole of what on earth was Rashi talking about, right? It shall be for you a safeguard. So I think Rashi really did answer the question. Because that strange language, it shall be for you a safeguard. Who's guarding who? Is the sheep guarding the people? Or were the people guarding the sheep? I think what Rashi was saying is that by taking the sheep 4 days in advance, which was a way of liberating yourself from your Egyptian masters. Because if you took it the last day, in the middle of all the chaos, you just take it quickly and your master might not know that you killed a sheep. No. You got to take it 4 days before. You have to be willing to answer that question when your master walks in and says, what are you doing with that sheep? And you say, I'm going to kill it. You have to show that you're willing to be independent, that you're no longer subservient. And at the same time, you're going to have to be a humble servant of God and accept that covenant as well through the circumcision. That will protect you. You will be protected. And that's how you get saved. Because God is going to touch each of the homes that submitted to Him, and each of the homes that was willing to throw off the yoke of slavery of the Egyptian masters and accept the humble servitude of God through circumcision. The homes that are willing to do that, those are the families that will be chosen to be the families of Israel. So God says, when I see the bloods, the two bloods, when I see those bloods, when I see that combination of liberty from human masters and submission to God, those are the families that the nation of Israel will be built from. And He chose us that night in Egypt. That's what happened on Passover. So it's a familiar story, but I hope I've given it some new meaning and some new depth of understanding. That's what I wanted to share tonight.
Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. I hope it made sense. Like I said,
it makes a lot of sense.
I hope it made sense.
One of the things that comes to my mind is that the Jews keep the Shabbat or the Shabbat keeps the Jews.
Exactly.
You know, the same mindset. One of the interesting things that I also thought about is at least Abraham, after he was circumcised, got a rest for 3 days. The Jews were on the run immediately.
Right.
Feel sorry for them. But here's the big thing that I've often wondered, and hopefully you can answer this from some midrash or the Talmud or something. Only those who are circumcised could keep the Passover. So during the wilderness, none of the children that were born kept the Passover, only those who left Egypt. So in other words, all those who ended up being circumcised by Joshua that were born, they may be 38 years old, but that was their first Passover they got to keep.
It could very well be, yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm thinking, because they couldn't. So as they're seeing all the other 40-year generation dying off, there might have been only 5 people keeping the Passover.
Right, and the Bible does tell us about the second year where they all did the Passover, but then they were all circumcised from the previous year still.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah, they may not
but
have been
in the subsequent years in the desert, yeah, all the people born during those years, meaning you could have someone who's in their mid-30s.
Exactly.
At the end of the times in the desert, never done the Passover.
Time.
Right.
I just thought that was fascinating, and then all of a sudden now they're probably excited they get to. They probably always wanted to, but couldn't.
Right. Oh, so let's also go back to that point. The circumcision and the Passover offering done right before they entered the land of Israel, it's the same themes. Right before they're about to wage war on the enemies. There's nothing more nationalistic and pride-producing than being victorious in battle over your enemies. God does not want our nationalistic drive for victory over our enemies to just be about us and about pride. It's supposed to be about our submission to Him. So therefore, right before they're about to make war and destroy the evil nations of Canaan and take possession of the land of Israel, God says, circumcise yourself first. First submit to God. And when we're humbly submitted to God, we can then also engage in this nationalistic activity.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. There was a congregation several thousand years ago, a couple thousand years ago. The synagogue was in Laodicea. And what's fascinating about Laodicea, do you know what that literally means? Democracy. Let the people decide, not God decide. And so the very foundation of democracy is let us decide, not let God make the decision. But that was the name of the city, not the name of the synagogue. That's the name of the city, was the Church of Laodicea. And it means democracy. So I thought that was fascinating. Does anybody have any quick questions for Rabbi? I thought this was wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Like I said when I started, I wasn't sure it would make sense. I hope it did. Yes?
Yes, I guess part of this is be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. You're trying to say how to translate that to a Christian of this time. Because I can see a whole lot of idols going on in our world of today, and how we need to have a new, do the same thing they're doing to submit to God and rid us of the...
Listen, we have to be willing... You know, I like the point you're making. If you think about those 4 days where they have the sheep, think of the statement they're making. There's a lot of people of faith in our society, in Western society. I shouldn't say just American society. There's a lot of people of faith in Western society who aren't willing to go out on a limb and profess their faith.
Yeah.
They're not willing to defend it. They're not willing to get up and say that this is who they are. They'd rather keep it private, keep it to themselves. When you're a slave and you take a sheep that is worshipped by your master and you're going to kill it in front of him, you're expressing your independence of him. But, as I said, as we fight evil, and we're all in this, we're at war right now, let's face it. Right now we're in it. It's not coming, it's now. We're at war culturally in the Western world for our values. As we fight, let's remember the lesson of the circumcision in this. Being victorious over our enemies and being bold and fighting the battles for God and throwing off the yoke of human bondage is all very valuable and all very important, and we have to fight those fights. But we shouldn't get arrogant about it.
Yes.
We should remember the goal isn't just to be free, the goal is to be servants of God and not servants of men.
Well, that's the whole point of everything.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
We're submitting to who is God, everything else isn't.
Any other questions? Going once. Going twice.
What if you're in the world, they've already done that I'm 51 and they've already incorporated in your birth, it's already taken care of before you think about it. I don't have any answer for what you're saying. Why are we ever?
It's a constant battle. As I said at the beginning, we fight this battle every day. Every day we fight this battle. Right? We have the combination of boldly fighting our enemies and throwing off the shackles of human bondage, but at the same time humbly submitting to God. Those are the two messages here, the combined message of the Passover offering.
All right, let's give him a big hand again. Thank you, Bezos.
Thank you.
Woo-hoo. All right, don't forget this Shabbat is going to be great. I can hardly wait. And then, of course, as he said, we have Passover coming right around the corner. Is everyone here signed up? I hope. All right, because there's like no more room. We're out of room. There's only a waiting. At 1,500 is what we'll have, but you know this is our first one since a long time. COVID and everything.
Is it a whole catered meal? You have
Yeah,
like this?
everything. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, over 300.
Is it expensive? No. Okay.
$30. So, but anyway, and you know we're just so grateful for Rabbi. And you're headed back to Tel Aviv now.
Yeah, I'm at the end of a almost 2-week trip. I've been all over the place. It's been an exciting trip. I don't know if any of you saw this online, but we did a big conference at Regent University. It was really the first one of its kind where we had 2 Orthodox Jewish scholars, one from Israel and one from New York, and 2 Christian scholars who came together in a symposium to talk about the theology of the land of Israel, and we had over 500 people who registered online to participate in it. It was and it's going to become an annual event, trying to have a greater impact in the Christian seminaries, bringing the message of Israel to them. They need it.
Yeah, exactly. Yay. And we're just so grateful for all the Orthodox rabbis that want to build bridges. And I'm so grateful for all the Christians that want to build bridges. This is what it's all about. Find out what we have in common and rejoice in that.
Amen.
I mean, how many of you ever disagree with your spouse? But that doesn't mean you want to kill them. Maybe, but no, I'm kidding. But anyway, disagreements are okay. So thank you very much, and we'll see you on Shabbat. Did you bring any of your books?
I did not, no.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
No, because I figure here you guys have them already.
Yeah. We have to order some more.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. You're dismissed.
Thank you.